Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. This week's topic is the labor theory of value. So it's basically the idea that the value of the stuff our economy produces comes from the labor of workers. So that's pretty straightforward. It's not to be denied that the work that people put in contributes to the stuff that we all get out of the economy. That's pretty straightforward. But what's worth exploring is to what extent it makes sense to kind of measure the value or frame the value of the output kind of strictly in terms of the labor that goes in. So economists as far back as Adam Smith and David Ricardo had that as a starting point. Like the product of the economy comes from the labor of the workers, and they kind of built their theories around this idea. And of course, Karl Marx is famous for taking this to another level and having this whole philosophy around the value of workers and the value of labor, and starting political movements and that kind of thing. The whole idea of communism and everything is very kind of a labor value based way of thinking. So we have two articles this week, and they kind of take opposite perspectives. Not kind of, but they take opposite perspectives on the labor theory of value. And the first article is by an Austrian economist named Steven Horwitz, and it's called "We're Still Haunted by the Labor Theory of Value." So he clearly thinks that this is not the right way to think about value in the economy, and he wants to somehow move us past it, like we should be past this already, that kind of thing. He is part of the Austrian School of Economics, and this is not a mainstream school of economics. This is what we call a heterodox school, but it had its time to shine in kind of the late 19th, early 20th century, where they came up with a lot of things that have kind of been integrated into mainstream economics. So you can think of the Austrian school as like a band that had some, really big hits a long time ago, and they're still technically doing concerts, but nobody cares about their new stuff. Or there are specific people who do, but like most of the stuff people want to hear is the original stuff. So he's a modern Austrian economist, so he cares about the new stuff as well, but he's talking about some of the old stuff in this article. And then the second article is by someone who's more in support of Marxism, and it actually comes from the website In Defense of Marxism, Marxist.com. And the article is called "An Introduction to Marx's Labor Theory of Value." And the name of the author is at the bottom of the article. I can't find it right now. Oh, Mick Brooks. Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. So the author of the article is Mick Brooks, and he takes, this article is much longer, and it's interesting because he actually kind of addresses most of the criticisms in the first article, but then the first article has this kind of like catch-all clause in it that the Austrian guy says, oh, they're going to come up with explanations for all these different things, but it's like when Copernicus, figured out that the planets revolved around the sun, and then all of the geocentrist people came up with explanations for why no, it's just like weird, patterns of the the planets. Everything's really going around the Earth and all of these different things. So he kind of like has this built-in automatic defense where you can't kind of argue with him, because he'll just write it off as okay, now you're just kind of coming up with more complicated explanations, and the labor theory of value is not parsimonious. And this is why when people write about Marxist stuff, it's always a slog to get through. And this is kind of evidenced by the fact that the Marxist article is much longer than the anti-labor theory of value article. So I want to start by reading a quote from the first article, the Austrian anti-labor theory article. So let me get the screen share up here. Okay, here we go. But the real Copernican revolution in economics was how the subjective theory of value related to the value of labor. Rather than seeing the value of outputs being determined by the value of the inputs, like labor, the subjective theory of value showed that it's the other way around. The value of inputs, like labor, were determined by the value of the outputs they helped produce. The high market value of well-prepared food is not the result of the high value of the chef's labor. Rather, the chef's labor is valuable precisely because he is able to produce food that the public finds especially tasty, beautiful, or healthy. So this is kind of one of the key differences between the labor theory of value and the kinds of theories of value that more mainstream economists think about. It's the difference between kind of having an input value theory or an output value theory. Is the most important thing the value of the thing you put in, and then the value of the output derives from that? Or is the most important thing, what you get out? And then what you get in is valuable because it gives you what you get out, right? So nobody is denying that labor contributes to the economy's production or something like that. I think everybody agrees on that, kind of like I was saying before. But the question is, where does the value ultimately start? So if you're thinking from a pure labor theory of value, like if you're just thinking all that matters is labor, then you're going to have to answer questions like, well, what if I work really hard on something that doesn't matter? And Marx has answers to these questions. The question is, then why is it useful to have that as the starting point? When we kind of, it's a little more intuitive to say like, oh, here's this product, here's this good or service, and it's useful to me, and I value it, and I get something out of it. So that's a more straightforward relationship right there, where you can tell a story about, the value of the labor input kind of intrinsically, but it maybe takes a few more steps. At least for me, it does in terms of the intuition, that to try to say that it's more than just about what it produces. So that's the first quote there. And I guess I'll keep my screen share on and just go over to the next one. So this is important because it's relevant to kind of like the basis for Marxism and communism and stuff like that. So he says, the argument that capitalism exploited workers depended crucially on the view that labor was the source of all value, and that the profits of capitalists were therefore taken from workers who deserved it. Marx's concept of alienation focused on the centrality of labor to making us human and the ways in which capitalism destroyed our ability to take joy in our work and control the conditions under which we created that value. Without the labor theory of value, it's not clear how much of Marx's critique of capitalism remains valid. So I'm not an expert on Marx. I kind of have my I judge everything, even if I'm not an expert on it. I have my kind of opinions on Marxism, but I think there are people in this discussion who know more about it than I do. So I'll be curious to hear you guys' perspectives, and if you felt, and I think there are some places in this article where I can tell he's not being fair, but I might not be able to identify all of them just from my own knowledge. So those are the kind of the first two quotes to get us started, to kind of like set our frame of reference, and then we'll get more into the second article in a little bit. But first, I want to go around the room and, with all the stuff I just said in mind, get people's initial thoughts on labor theory of value, and even connecting it up to basic income. So if we have a basic income, what does that mean? Because you're getting paid not for your work. How does that connect up with the labor theory of value? And if you're buying stuff and you're getting it, and the income you got, the money you got to buy it with, came from not contributing labor, how does that kind of like fit into the picture? So anything on labor theory of value, anything I just said, anything from the articles, anything about the connection to basic income. So we're going to go Derek, Richard, and then Charles. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, to some extent, a functional basic income would raise a lot of questions for labor theory of value, but then you can also look around and look at all the things that are kind of like basic incomes that we already have, and we see that money still works without the person spending the money having contributed labor. That's something to consider. I really like in the first article, the comparison of the input value versus the output value. I do think it's interesting that he uses the word subjective, and he says this is subjective value because, well, it's what everyone has a different idea. But that's, subjectively, someone could say labor is valuable, right? I mean, I think the real difference there is that it's the customer, it's someone else who's picking the output. There's another actor there that's kind of left out of the conversation, which I thought was interesting.
Cool. Yeah. I like that input output distinction. Let's go Richard, Charles, and then Bethany.
Well, there's a point that they say that, well, I heard this before, that $1,000 a month is equivalent to a $5 per hour raise. And in Georgia's, they said that, well, we did that a number of months ago, that they had since we don't pay enough to to laborers, though they'll never have enough money to buy all their output. So there's all sorts of things like that that point out that the laborers put out more value than they receive in the end and stuff.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Regardless of what we're actively valuing, if people get their income through jobs and we're producing our value as output, how are they going to buy that output if the only income they get is through jobs? Let's go Charles, Bethany, and then Elizabeth.
Yeah, it would take much longer to elaborate on why I think this is the case, but I actually think the labor theory of value would do more to undermine universal basic income, the value of universal basic income, rather than kind of support it. Again, it's a kind of long explanation. And I think in some sense, both of capitalism, the conventional neoclassical or the current neoclassical view of capitalism, and the labor theory of value somewhat ignores the overall societal structure that's involved. It makes a lot of assumptions, the same way Marx makes a lot of assumptions. I think the issue with capitalism, the assumption it makes is that everything is supposedly all fair and free market and supply and demand, an invisible hand. And I think anybody who has dealt with it will say realistically that that's not the case. And I think coming back to where I think why I think universal basic income in some ways is opposed to labor theory of value is that the issues that UBI could fix is precisely because the current market is not properly valuing the output of a lot of people, and UBI would go a long ways to address that, so that so certain proper output is being valued properly, and people are given a basic income for their needs.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, we might talk more about what it means to properly value people's output. Let's go Bethany, Elizabeth, and then Martin.
Hi. So I'm curious about the article we're going to move towards, because I find the labor theory of value difficult to defend. In my mind, to me, like you said, it's much more intuitive to think about the thing that we value is the product, and labor is almost the activities we define as, or I would define as, like leading to products that we value. Otherwise, it would just be like, I'm doing an activity that I enjoy or something. And that might be, in that sense, my energy expenditure might be intrinsically valuable. But when we talk about labor, it seems like the point is that you're producing something, and the value comes from how much people care about what you produce or get enjoyment out of it or whatever. So I'm interested to see what the defense of it is. And in terms of basic income, it seems to me that if you could only produce, like if the value of the products we had to come from labor, it's going to be necessary to incentivize quite a bit of labor to get a lot of value. Like you can't easily have, in that worldview, it seems like a lot of value produced without labor or with minimal labor or something like that, right? So that seems to me like it would require at least a smaller basic income than if you imagine the economy could have lots of value produced with very little labor, because then you can afford to give people more money. That's not an incentive to contribute their labor, and you can still get a lot of valuable products or whatever you want to happen. So it does seem related to me at least in terms of like the amount of kind of prosperity you could have without incentivizing work, or the amount of basic income that you might be able to give people. So I'm interested in exploring that too. Thanks.
Okay, great. Let's go Elizabeth, Martin, and then Joan.
I think a bunch of the points that I was sort of thinking of have largely been touched on by folks already. But this idea that that we can objectively determine like the value of the output that someone produces, and then also somehow objectively determine like what portion of that value they should get. Like he has this very simplistic, like, oh, the chef gets lots of money because he makes food that people want to pay a lot of money for. And it's like, well, okay, why do people want to pay a lot of money for that? Like, are they somewhere where like there are very few restaurants because of zoning laws, or like big box corporations have come in and bought up everywhere else? So it's like, okay, yeah, this chef can charge really high prices for his food because you have to drive 2 towns away to get like any other food that's like that. And like, okay, maybe the chef gets a lot of money, but like there's also all the people who are like, waiting tables and doing all this other stuff. Like I imagine like the janitors are not getting super well paid, but like no one wants to come to your fancy restaurant if it's filthy. And so while the initial argument feels really intuitive, I think it's a lot more complicated in practice.
Yeah, I like that. So there are lots of things that can go into the price of a product, and not all of them are going to directly mean necessarily something about the price of the labor that goes into it. So he kind of implied that the price of the product would determine the price of the labor, which is not exactly right either. So let's go to Martin and then Joan.
Hi. So Soviet studies, and so up in the attic, I still have my some of my Karl Marx textbooks, and so I suppose while it might be surprising somebody goes to the United States Military Academy and studies Marx, but that's what I did. And the last book I read Marx was titled Karl Marx, Great, fairly recent.
You're having trouble coming through, Martin, on your audio.
How bad?
You're breaking up a little bit. Medium bad. I can make out most of what you're saying, but not all of it.
All right. Well, maybe if I don't move so much. Anyway, my point was simply going to be for someone who studied Marx, whatever, a bunch of decades ago and read something recently, I find Marx to be incredibly dense. And sometimes I feel as though it's sort of dense for the sake of being dense. And I do other things that are complex and artificial intelligence, and there's a lot of math and all in that. And it's just complicated math, but sometimes I find, particularly in Marxist theory, specifically to labor value, labor theory of money, labor theory of value. I just offer a thought experiment, sort of a fourth industrial revolution thought experiment of nobody does any work whatsoever. Everything's done by robots, AI, and all that. Then what is value? And because there's no labor, right? So anyway, I would just I'll leave it at that. That is sort of as a thought experiment.
Yeah, it's a good question. I like that thought experiment. Joan, go ahead.
Okay, well, like Elizabeth, I think there's a lot of complications in terms of determining the value of something, and it's not only obviously by labor, how much labor, or even what kind of labor, but how the item is valued subjectively, and that's pointed out in the article. But I'm interested about the idea of how this relates to basic income, because separating the value from labor, the value of what's produced from the labor that produces it, kind of gives us more insight into the idea of basic income as a separate, a kind of separate operation apart from what's produced, and that's the way it should be. Yeah, well, I'll have more to say later. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so these are some great initial comments. Something that I like to say is that the labor market is a market for getting people to do things. So you're paying people to spend their time in ways other than they would normally spend it. So with the example of the chef and the janitors, et cetera, you might be producing a really great product, a really great meal that people want to pay a lot for. But in terms of what you pay the workers, you're going to pay them enough to get them to do the work. And maybe, you know, 5-star chef or whatever is you know, harder to come by. So you're going to have to pay more to get one of those, but you don't have to pay as much to get the dishwashers and the janitors to do the work. But they're all contributing to this really important product, and they're all working very hard and that kind of thing. So then we can start to think about, well, maybe there's different kinds of value. Like this is something that without this particular form of labor, this product is not going to get made. The service is not going to be provided. So therefore, it is incredibly valuable in that sense, in the sense that if you didn't have it, it wouldn't, you know, the thing wouldn't get done. But it might not be valuable in the sense that its price is high, because, you know, maybe there's a lot of people who are willing to do this particular kind of job, and you can keep the price low, and you only pay as much as you need to, that kind of thing. So I think there's lots of different ways to look at value, and a question we can ask is, why is it useful, or under what conditions is it useful to think of value in terms of labor, to have that as the basis for our understanding of value? And certainly for Marx, you can understand it because he was coming from a place of wanting a kind of a more socialist world, a worker-oriented, you know, politics, that kind of thing. So he started there, and then he, you know, my kind of feeling of it is that he kind of developed an economic theory and a philosophy around the politics that he wanted. And this, of course, is not unusual. Like, you know, Milton Friedman was Jewish, and, you know, he was in the 20th century, and he was, you know, very much afraid of, you know, Nazism coming back, that kind of thing. So he was very much against the power of the state. And he developed an economic theory that said big government is bad, and it needs to be all free markets, because, you know, his concern was that if you have a powerful central authority, it turns into Nazis and they kill all the Jews. Like that was Friedman's motivation. And then Marx has kind of like a similar thing going on, where he sees, you know, all these workers who are suffering, and you know, of course, just intuitively, we have this moral value around hard work. So he kind of took that, he took existing economic theory, and he kind of amplified it for his political agenda. And that's not to say, you know, just because you have these political motivations or these ideologies doesn't mean that the result of your theory is somehow tainted or wrong, but it's useful to kind of know what the vision is behind something like this. So as far as the labor, as far as the labor theory of value goes, there's a lot of things that you need to think about in order to make it work, or a lot of things you need to define and set parameters for. So a big one is, what is labor and what is leisure, right? You know, you have to be able to draw a line between what counts as someone's labor time and what counts as their leisure time. When is someone acting in the capacity as a worker, and when are they just a person living their lives? So you really have to define what's a job and what's not. Does volunteer work count as labor? You know, I think for Marx, he lived in an environment that had a very clear kind of like wage labor structure, you know, capitalist wage labor structure. That's very much similar to what we have today. Maybe it's a little bit looser today. You know, we have gig economy, and we're trying to kind of fit that into our understanding of how labor is supposed to work, with clearly defined jobs and stuff like that, and it gets a little bit tricky. But maybe it was a little bit less tricky back then, and he saw this, you know, kind of quick transition from, you know, kind of like a feudalist organization of production to a more capitalist thing, and it was just kind of like he's trying to understand the nature of this capitalist system. So he's able to, within the context of that, define what counts as work and what doesn't. But for me, I like to think kind of bigger picture. You know, people's time is their time, and they're spending it how they spend it. And then you might be paying them a certain amount to get them to do something differently with some of their time. And you know, the labor is not necessarily a time-based thing, but it's, you know, like you pay someone to do a thing. You know, obviously in the real world, we pay people hourly wages, but sometimes we pay them just for the final product. And then they kind of like estimate the amount of hours it'll take or something like that. There's all this kind of fuzzy stuff that that we get into in labor negotiations, job negotiations, wages and stuff like that. And that same kind of fuzzy stuff comes into play when you're thinking about the theory too. Like what does all this stuff mean? And I think, you know, like if we're just kind of like imagining an ideal economy, which is kind of what I like to start from. Marx started from, hey, look at what's happening right now, and you know, what can we do better than that? I like to start from, you know, what's kind of the ideal outcome, and what would that have to look like, and then you can kind of fill in the steps of how to get there. And obviously, you know, like I feel like basic income is an important one of those steps. So for labor, if you just think of people's time as their time, then you're not really defining what's labor and what's not. And then it gets harder to say, okay, well, this person's labor time is being overpaid or underpaid, because how do you even define what is their paid time and what is not? And, you know, like they could be choosing to do one thing at any moment and that kind of thing. There's a whole kind of continuum there. And that makes it hard to think about the labor theory of value. But maybe you could think about it in a capitalist context. And I think it probably, if you're living in a world with an efficient labor market where people are only being hired because you want the product of the labor, then, you know, labor is being used efficiently, and then you can start to think about the pricing of labor as you know, being compared to the value of the labor that's being contributed and that kind of stuff. But it gets kind of complicated. So I'm going to get into a quote from the second article, but people can start, you know, raising their hands if they feel like they have any comments at any point. So here's a quote from the introduction to Marx's labor theory of value to kind of get us started on this part of the discussion. I'm going to share a screen here. Okay. So that a commodity is both a use value, or I should actually interrupt myself here. So Marx uses the word commodity different than most people do. So when Marx says commodity, he's thinking about, in general, kinds of the products of kind of the capitalist system or the economic machine, that kind of thing. Typically, when we talk about commodities, we're thinking about like resources that can be traded on the market that are roughly equivalent, like gold and oil and grain and coffee and stuff like that. He has a broader definition of commodity, which is kind of all the products that we use that are kind of mass produced in factories and stuff like that. So that's important to keep in mind with Marx. He uses different language, which makes it difficult for people to translate between kind of the language of economists and the language of Marx and that kind of thing. So that makes Marx a little bit tricky too. So let's get back to the quote. So that a commodity is both a use value and an exchange value is a contradiction. What does that mean? It means that labor expended on the commodity is only a potential value. Someone must be prepared to buy it. Value has to be validated in the marketplace. Likewise, it is irrelevant to me if you spend twice as long to make a chair as everybody else. You have just wasted your time. I and every other buyer expect an average price determined by the extant productivity in that sector at the moment. It is not the amount of labor individually or accidentally expended on a commodity that determines its value, but the amount socially necessary for its production. This is a vital concept when we come to look at the dynamics of the capitalist system. So this isn't Marx writing, but it's someone who's kind of summarizing Marx, and it's important that they're pointing out that that no, they're not just saying that labor is arbitrarily valuable. It has to be validated by the market. And this is, this is something that Marxists bring up a lot when people feel like their views are being oversimplified or misinterpreted or something like that. But a question we can ask is, if the labor expended on the commodity is only a potential value, and if it has to be validated by the market, if the commodity has to be validated by the market, then why do you need the labor story at all in the first place? If everything is being validated by the market, then why don't we talk about the value of a commodity in just coming from its validation by the market? So that's more of kind of like the subjective perspective, right? It's more, how much are people willing to pay for this thing, right? That's how useful is it to me? How much am I willing to pay to buy it? So I don't think this really gets around the question. Yeah, let's go to Joan. Joan, you're muted.
That was something on my mind, actually, when we were talking earlier, that there's a separation between the value, what's called the value of labor, and the value of the end product. I mean, you could have a product, I think it's mentioned in one of the articles, that that no labor goes into particularly. It's something that's rare. It's or it's an art object that isn't hard to make, but it happens to be valued for beauty. It happens to be a subjective value. So there's no labor connection there particularly. So that whole idea of labor value is a little bit mysterious to me in the first place. They both make the separation of, it's not about numbers of hours that you use, like the chair, it's not about how long it takes you to make it, but both articles want to connect the value of labor somehow to the value of the product. And I'm having trouble with that connection, because I don't see that it's a necessary connection at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the prices, the price of the labor, so there is a connection in the sense that if I want to produce a product and I have to hire a certain amount of labor at a certain price in order to produce that product, I'm not going to sell that product at a price that's less than what I need to pay the labor to make it. There's going to be some markup there, right? Like I'm going to pay the labor and I'm going to pay myself, and then I'm going to sell the product. Yeah. So there is that connection there. The question is just, there's a lot of different ways to think about the value. So the Defense of Marxism article brings up the diamond water paradox. So people are willing to pay a lot for diamonds, but they're just these shiny stones, and they're not really willing to pay for water, but it's necessary for life. Like you can't live without water. So kind of on one level, water is more valuable than diamonds, but then on another level, diamonds have a higher price than water. So why is that? And I think the answer is that prices reflect more than just the subjective value to people. Like subjectively, I need water, but subjectively, I'm not going to pay a lot for water because I know I can get it cheap. So there's different ways of thinking about value, and it can be a little bit weird to try to connect them up with each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's go to Richard.
You were talking about diamonds. Well, there's an artificial diamond, the cubic zirconia, and the regular diamond. The regular diamond is like mined thousands of feet underground or something, or maybe they're in a stream bed or something. And whilst the cubic zirconia is like a clump of coal crushed to thousands of newtons or whatever.
So the cubic zirconium is actually a fake diamond, but they do have actual lab-grown real diamonds. And I think maybe that's what you're talking about.
Yes.
Yep.
Well, why is it what makes a cubic zirconia more expensive or less expensive than a diamond when they're practically the same thing?
Well, cubic zirconium is not the same thing as a diamond, but there are lab-grown diamonds that are the same thing, and they have the same, indices of refraction, so you get that same sparkle, and it's literally the same substance. It's crushed up carbon into this crystalline form, and I think the answer has to do with just the rarity of the natural diamond. So if you just have two of them side by side, you might not be able to tell them apart. The ones that are taken out of the ground are certified, so they have these little things etched into them, these little markings etched into them, so you can know they're genuine, that kind of thing. But really, like for any purpose of like how it looks or even industrial uses of diamonds, it doesn't really matter which one you use. So you're probably going to use the cheaper one. I had a friend who was buying an engagement ring for his girlfriend, and he had the option between the lab-grown diamond and the natural diamond, and the guy was like, so this is the natural diamond, and this one was created in a lab, and it only costs 1/10 the price. And he's like, you're telling me that we made that in a lab? That's so cool, I want that one. So it doesn't always work for everyone, but the market is such that people kind of do attribute value to these things, and it's not an unusual thing, but that speaks to kind of the subjectivity of value. And how much, it's not just subjective in terms of how much you want it and how useful it is to you, because we all want water and water is very useful to us, but it's also subjective in terms of how much you're willing to pay. And people can be willing to pay different things, especially if something's scarce and it's like trendy to have that thing or something like that. Yeah, go ahead, Charles.
So I was just going to say it's also more of a supply and demand issue. So with water, it's very essential, but it's also quite abundant. That's why it is quite cheap. And in some ways, this is an issue where, as a society, we do see the positive externality. So externality in economics is basically one of those things that's not directly priced. So it's very hard to say, okay, I'm going to price like oxygen or something, but it does have certain value to the public. So it's one of those positive externalities, that our society actually helps subsidize the production of water. So think about water treatment plants, those things I think mostly are public, and we try to increase the availability and supply of water to make it cheap so that people have healthy lives or whatever and can do more productive things. In contrast, if you take a look at diamonds, the cartels that actually mine the diamonds, they artificially restrict the supply of diamonds. If diamonds become as abundant as, I don't know, coal, then I doubt the price would be as high.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And you brought up an important point where there are some resources that are allocated by the market, and then there are some resources that are allocated by the government, by our institutions, and that includes like utilities and infrastructure and all that kind of stuff. And water is one of those things. The government makes sure we have access to water. There are some resources that are most efficiently allocated that way, and they're not going to have a price in the market because people get them for free, or they're not usually going to have a price in the market. I guess you can buy designer water or whatever that came out of a volcano on an island or something. But yeah, I mean that's something important to keep in mind. And then it's also useful to remember that a lot of the things that are most valuable to us in terms of what provides us the most benefit, the most utility, are things we don't have to buy. Like the fact that the sun is in the sky, that's not something we have to pay for, but it's incredibly valuable. We would not exist if we didn't have that. So that's true of government services, but it's also true of like the air around us and stuff like that. Perhaps, our governments and institutions are helping keep our air cleaner than it otherwise would be, which is great. And that's another service. But there's, it's the same thing with work, right? Most of the important work that we do in our lives is not paid. We feed ourselves and take care of our family and have social interactions and all of that stuff. That takes energy. That's stuff we work on, and we play games and sports, and all that stuff is not paid. Most of human existence is not. You're not paying people to be people. You're only paying them when you need to get them to do something different with their time some of the time. So I don't view labor as like this labor in terms of like paid labor market labor as this fundamental thing. And it is of course important. The market is how we get access to things that we wouldn't have access to if we didn't trade it for. So it is an important thing, and it's important to kind of study how that works. But I don't know. Yeah, I guess I guess I'm looking for someone here to come in and say something about why it should be labor as the most important thing or not. But we can get to another quote that might give us. Oh, we actually have some comments on the live stream. So Zach on the live stream says, I think labor theory of value is good only in that it is a critique of the inherent devaluing of labor that is capital efficiency. Capitalism is broken. A critique focusing on it will follow suit. So I think the idea that capitalism is broken, if you're expecting everybody to get their incomes from jobs, then I think it's true that capitalism is broken. And what people mentioned before in the initial comments was that if the economy is producing all this stuff and people aren't getting paid enough to produce it, then they won't be able to buy it. But basic income can provide a short circuit there, where you can give people enough money to buy the economy's output without paying them through jobs enough to buy the economy's output. So let's go to Bethany.
Yeah, we might get to this in some of the quotes, but I'm curious if you could give us like the best possible case for labor theory of value, or maybe summarize the article's best points, because I think a lot of us are maybe skewing against it. So I'm just kind of curious, like what the really strong arguments for it look like, and the kind of the value that people think that it adds to the discussion.
Yeah, so that's an interesting challenge. Well, I think it's true, certainly in smaller scale societies, that we need to give people, I mean, always, if we need people to work, we need to give them an incentive to work. And in smaller scale societies, that's a social incentive, right? If you're living in a small tribe, small family, that kind of thing, you need everybody to kind of pull their own weight. So then you scale up to a capitalist, a large scale capitalist society with a market and all of that stuff. You look at all these people who are pulling their own weight, or pulling the equivalent of their own weight, but they're pulling it for someone else. So that feels like an injustice. That feels like they're doing their part to contribute, but they're not getting their reward back out. And those two things are very much intuitively and functionally connected to each other in a smaller scale society. Mm-hmm. In a larger scale market system, instead of having social incentives to get people to do it, like you're shamed if you're not contributing to your tribe and going out hunting or something like that, we have money instead. And then it's also true that maybe we don't need everybody to work, or we don't need people to work. We just people to work as much. We just need the right amount of overall labor to be contributed to the economy. So then, of course, you would naturally expect that the compensation for labor would be a lot lower. But now you've broken that connection between the access to the economy's output and the contribution that you put in to a large extent. So I think Marx was recognizing this breakdown, and instead of saying, hey, maybe this isn't how we need to allocate people's access to the economy's output, because we're already allocating enough labor and we're not necessarily needing to pay people that much to do it. He kind of went in the other direction, and he said, okay, people are contributing, but they're not getting their fair share back, that kind of thing. And I kind of gave you the argument for it while also giving you the argument against it. I mean, I think there, it is intuitive that if you put work in and you're doing what society asks of you, and you're still not able to kind of scrape by at a reasonable level, that feels like something's broken in the system. And something is broken in the system, but it's not necessarily a consequence of you not getting paid enough for your work. It might be a consequence of you not getting paid enough in general, a consequence of lack of basic income, for example. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we got a couple more comments on the live stream. Nash Ridgeback says, with UBI, all labor relationships become one of mutual agreement instead of coerced and forced acquisition of value from others. Capitalism isn't broken for those on the top, only those on the bottom. So I think, everything's kind of on a continuum, right? So the higher the basic income, the more freedom you have to choose to spend your time how you want. If it's a really low basic income, then the effect is small. If it's a really big basic income, then the effect is larger. But I probably wouldn't frame it in terms of absolutes. Like if there's a basic income, then suddenly you have freedom or something like that. Freedom is a continuum as well. And then coercion is a continuum, right? Because we do need a certain amount of labor being performed in the economy. So you could imagine a hypothetical economy where we're giving people enough money through basic income that they're able to buy the economy's entire output. But the problem is now you might not have enough incentive for people to perform the labor to generate that output. So you need to lower the basic income until the incentive to work is high enough that you have an efficient labor market where everything is getting produced and people can buy the output. So naturally, the people who work are going to be able to access more of the output, and that's their reward for working. You just probably wouldn't want to, or you definitely wouldn't want to lower the basic income below that, because then you need to find other mechanisms to provide money to people, and that can include economic policies that create unnecessary jobs, kind of like what we have today with we have a lot of economic policies designed to create jobs, like monetary stimulus and that kind of thing, which is now you're creating jobs as an excuse to pay people instead of because there's work that needs doing. So that can be a big difference there. Let's see. There's another one here. So Zach says the goal of owners, so capitalists, is to reduce the amount and value of labor while maximizing the utility of the widget. They have succeeded and it has hurt the well-being of society. So this kind of thing, I think employers, I guess their goal isn't to reduce the value of labor, but to reduce the price of labor. If we want to kind of like talk about the specific kind of value, they want to pay as little as possible for the labor they need. And that comes from reducing the amount of labor they need and reducing the amount they have to pay for it. And if you imagine a world where people's incomes wouldn't suffer because we're using labor more efficiently, then that's actually a good thing. We're using less labor. We don't need to pay as much for it. That means the basic income can be higher and everybody's better off. We have an efficient labor market and efficient output and that kind of thing. So it's really like a lot of these, I'm not going to say everything, but a lot of the common criticisms you hear of capitalism, of workers not being paid enough and that kind of thing, that comes from the fact that we expect people to get their incomes from jobs. So yeah, and like we kind of compensate for that by getting employers to pay workers more or to hire more workers and that kind of thing. And I would argue that's really inefficient. Because if you're paying workers for any reason other than providing an incentive for them to work, then that's an inefficiency in the labor market. If you're hiring workers for any other reason than you need the labor being done, then that's an inefficiency in the labor market. And of course, any individual business is not going to hire a worker unless it's profitable for them to do so. But we use economic policy to change what's profitable. We keep companies afloat that might otherwise fail in a more competitive market or something like that. Like you hear about zombie companies in Japan and that kind of thing. But really, anytime we kind of keep monetary policy more easy than it needs to be, you've got a lot of businesses that are in business that wouldn't be in business if our market were more efficient. Go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, I just wanted to put like a human face on when you talk about it being inefficient, and part of that is that like you're wasting people's time, right? So it's not just like a vague concept where the economy is not working efficiently. Like regular people, people are being harmed in this way of like having to do work and not spend that time with their family or other things when there's not really any valuable output coming out of it, right? So.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. You're keeping people needlessly busy as an excuse to pay them. So you're wasting people's time. There's always this trade-off between labor and leisure. And if we try to keep everyone employed, then we're saying, okay, we want to keep everyone busy. And if our goal is just full employment, if our goal is just to keep everyone employed, then we're not respecting that trade-off between labor and leisure. We should really only want to employ people when the cost of employing them and taking away their leisure is worth the benefit of the output that the labor produces. So it can be, if you're in kind of a labor theory of value perspective, then you can end up in a situation where you want to get jobs for everyone and keep everyone busy, and you might not be thinking about the costs of that. If your goal is full employment, then you're not thinking about what that would mean. That's maximum employment is minimum leisure, right? So that's something to keep in mind. It hurts people, and when we talk about efficiency, that means not using up resources unnecessarily. And we can think of labor as a resource. We can think of people's time as a resource that we ideally want to conserve as much as possible, but we know we have to use it some of the time. Yeah. So let's see. We got a few more comments on the live stream, but I think I'm going to go to another quote from the article. So here we go. I like this one. This article was long enough that I could find a lot of good quotes in it. There is no such thing as a weight that we can isolate and measure independently of objects with weight. Likewise, with value, we can't just add up the quantities of labor congealed in the product at different stages of production. In the case of weighing something, we start off by placing one object on a set of scales and finding it equal to the item on the other side, say a lump of metal. At a later stage, as we start weighing things regularly, we will probably ascribe a conventional measure to the lump of metal, for example, 10 kilograms. This, of course, is how money emerged from the exchange process. So this is right? We need kind of a standard of value. And I've talked with Derek about this a lot, and some other people. You can kind of divide the concept of money into two things. There's the currency unit, which is kind of the standard measure, and then there are the money tokens, which are the things we pass back and forth to pay each other, and they're denominated in the currency unit. So you have the dollar unit, and then you have the dollar bills that are denominated in the dollar unit. And there's the actual cash and central bank money and stuff like that. That's kind of the purest form of money in our economy. It's bank deposits are IOUs for cash, so they're kind of like a secondary level of money in our economy. But they all kind of trade at the same value, and that value is kind of the standard value. So the question here, and the reason they're bringing this up, the fact that you can measure the weight of different objects, and then you kind of standardize it based on a single token. We have that too. We standardize, the dollar unit based on a dollar, that kind of thing. And he is saying that the underlying value of money, or the kind of the intuition he's getting at, is that labor is kind of like this fundamental substrate of value, in the same way that I guess mass is the fundamental substrate of weight or something like that. So it's kind of it's what tips the scale of value if we're thinking about value. And I think everything he's saying here is right. I just don't think that labor is the underlying thing. And there's a reason why when we have a currency like the dollar, we try to keep it stable with respect to a basket of consumer goods. So consumer goods are the economy's output. We want the dollar to be able to purchase a consistent amount of stuff from day to day. Intuitively in our minds, we want to be able to know what a dollar is worth. And I don't think when we're thinking about how much a dollar is worth, we're thinking about how much wage it translates into, or how much labor it translates into. We're thinking about, well, how much stuff can you buy with it? And that's kind of the frame of reference that markets need to be able to set their prices against. You have this kind of standard unit of value against which to set prices. And that's more of an output theory of value than it is an input theory of value, like the labor theory of value. So yeah, go ahead, Richard.
There we go. Well, if you have control over the clock and the scale, like for instance, you put if you have the table like tilted or something, where you put the scale, and so it's always off by a certain percentage. Or if it measures on the there also mentions in the article that they paid by the day instead of by the hour or anything like that at a certain point. If you like if you are able to like alter the time on the clock, make it slower or something like that, then you get more out of a person, out of the people. So there's every incentive to do things like that. If there's no one, no government or official or anything like that checking it to see if it's fair.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point, and it kind of brings up the issue of, are you paying people for their time, or are you paying people for, the amount of output that they have? If you're paying people by the day, then they might, sit around gold bricking and, doing the minimum amount of work. If you're paying them for, well, we need this particular project, completed, and these are the, requirements that you have to meet in order for it to be considered done, then you pay them that amount, and they can take however long they want to take. They probably want to take less time because then they have more free time and they get paid the same amount. So there's some interesting incentives there on both sides. There's incentives from the employer side where they're trying to get the most out of the worker, and then there's incentives from the worker side where they're trying to get the most out of the employer, or do the minimum amount that gets them the reward and that kind of thing. And this stuff can get really complicated. I think in the article he's talking about how much he's drawing this equivalent between how much labor you contribute and then how much value is ultimately produced. So he's saying like, well, the first 2 hours that you work might be enough to cover your entire wages if you were if you assess that value independently in the economy. That's how much value you contributed. You've earned your wages back in the first 2 hours. So then your remaining 6 hours of work, if you're working an 8-hour day, is unpaid labor. You're not being paid for it, but the employer is getting the benefit from it. So he's creating kind of like this fairness argument type of thing, which is intuitive, and it makes sense. To kind of Bethany's point about what is the argument for labor theory of value. If people don't earn enough money to buy the economy's output, then you have a problem there as well. Yeah, I mean, I think from a kind of a moral perspective, you can make these arguments, and they make sense if you define labor in this way. But I think that's a really hard thing to do. Why should an employer pay the worker twice as much if there's another worker out there who's looking for a job who's willing to work half as much, that kind of thing. There are things we can do to boost wages, minimum wage and other things, but that, like, what's the point if we don't care? So I kind of like to imagine an economy in which, just as a society, we don't care how much people are paid for their jobs. They'll go work at their jobs if they're being paid an amount that's enough to get them to work. And some people are volunteering, and then maybe there's a continuum between volunteer work and what we would now consider minimum wage work, and that kind of thing. And it's all okay, or just spending your time in the way you want. Yeah, so it gets tricky when you're trying to really pin down what counts as labor and what doesn't. And you can see this in the real world too, where you might have an organization or a company that's really small, and people are working really hard and just staying overnight, and they really care about the product, and they're passionate, and they care about the business, and that's fine, and they don't care how much they're being paid. But then you kind of reach this tipping point, and you never know when it's going to be, where suddenly your workers feel like they're not being paid enough, or that it's not fair, or you have people who are volunteers or interns who feel like they're being exploited or something like that. And there really is no clear dividing line between kind of people just spending their time how they want, and people from people spending their time how they want, and people feeling like they have to do this, and they deserve to be paid, and they're not being paid. And that's kind of different on an individual level, and it's different we judge different people differently, whether we're thinking of them as employers, and the dividing line between what's an employer and what's not can be tricky too. So this is all really complicated stuff, and you have to start thinking about this stuff when you live in the kind of society we live in, where we have labor regulations. Are Uber drivers, people who are using an app to connect with other people and share their cars and do rides? Are they self-employed contractors, or are they employees of Uber, right? We have these kinds of debates, and we have to take them to court and draw these lines, right? But this is a sign that kind of the concept of what's work and what's not is maybe a little bit fuzzy and a little bit broken in how we organize our society. So let's see. So TIVV3 Gaming Learn and Enjoy says, sounds like a dubious way to get markets going. David Graeber points toward paying soldiers as a reason for establishing currency. So I like to point out that there's a lot of different ways to impart value to something, like a currency. So one way you could do it is by paying soldiers, and then I guess there's this story about kind of in colonial Massachusetts, they paid their soldiers in little tickets, and then they said to the townspeople that you had to pay your taxes using these little tickets, and then the townspeople, in order to be able to pay their taxes, they had to sell things to the soldiers, and the soldiers spent the little tickets. So that's kind of a way of establishing value for a kind of token. It's not necessarily sufficient to do that to establish a currency. So lots of things have value, and there are lots of ways to establish value. That's kind of like one story about how you could do it. But the thing that's special about currency isn't that it has value, it's that it has standard value. It's that it can buy a standard amount of stuff from the economy. It's not, its price isn't moving all around, and people generally understand that it's a stable and reliable standard. So that's what's special about currency. It's something we all coordinate on. So in order to tell a story about currency, you have to tell a story not just about how it gets value or how it gets its initial value, but how its value is kept stable. So this is kind of thing I talk about a lot. Maybe it's not as relevant to the labor theory of value, but it is relevant in the sense that when we see how we maintain the stability of currency, we're doing it based on output value, not input value. We're doing it based on a basket of consumer goods, as I was mentioning before. Yeah. So let's see. Let's go to another quote from the article. Okay, machinery just passes its value unchanged to the final product to the extent that it depreciates. It aids the worker in creating surplus value, but does not itself create new value. That is why all the other elements of the production process, apart from labor power, count for the capitalist as constant capital. So this is a little bit speaking to Martin's point about a world where it's all robots. And I think if you kind of take the Marxist perspective to an extreme, the labor theory of value perspective to an extreme, they would probably say that all the machinery and all of those robots, even if they were built by other robots, if you go far enough back up the chain, some labor went into creating that technology and building the first robot that built all the other robots, or something like that. So it still comes back to labor. And they talk about the concept of dead labor of people who aren't even alive anymore, inventions that they had, and that kind of thing. And I think that gets a little bit tricky, because if all of your labor is dead labor, then how is that really relevant to the people who are alive today, and what they deserve to be compensated for? So that's just kind of an interesting thought. And you do have to kind of go through these kinds of contortions to make the Marxist thing work. It maybe made a little more sense in the 19th century when you could more clearly draw the connection between the labor that went into making the machine, and then you could tell a story about how the value of the machine is depreciating over time until it's not being used anymore. This is something from finance and accounting, where you have a certain piece of equipment and then you estimate how long it's going to last, and then on your balance sheet when you write the value of it, it's how much value does it have left to produce according to your original calculation. But this is always just kind of a it's just a kind of a calculation, an estimate of just kind of amortizing costs and stuff like that. Doesn't really reflect anything real. And a lot of times you'll estimate your depreciation and then replace your machine at the end, but the machine is still fine and it could have produced more and that kind of thing. So I'm noticing this both with this part here, the kind of depreciating of the machines, and also from before, when he was talking about, what was he talking about? Yeah, there was something about the, I don't know what it was. There was another thing that was analogous that we talked about before, about, oh right, like the socially necessary labor, and just kind of averaging out what would be the efficient amount of labor in this market. So if you kind of deviate from that and make a chair really inefficiently, then that doesn't count. But we're kind of like averaging it out. And the idea that you can even do that based on what the market looks like now, I think is a little bit dubious too. So they kind of come up with all these ways of saying, no, it really is labor. And you can tell this story, right? You can always tell this story if you want to, just like you can always tell a story about how the sun orbits around the earth and everything orbits around the earth. You can always tell that story. You just have to come up with these wrinkles and complications and like, oh no, we're not talking about that. We're talking about this. We're not talking about how much time someone actually puts in or how hard someone actually works, but we're talking about if it were efficient, how much value would it produce, and that kind of thing. And if that's what you're talking about, then why don't you just talk about that and not worry about kind of tying it to labor? Talk about the value that's produced, and that's still kind of my intuition. Go ahead, Richard.
You talked about how Marxists would justify the automation and things, even robots to build other robots and things, that far enough back that they would someone would have to build that robot, the first robot that created the other ones. Well, how would you justify reparations for slavery when no one alive today is a slave or was a slave or whatever? And what about the Black people who were not were from Africa and were slaves and things like that? There's all sorts of things like that you don't have that make this whole process opaque, and you don't know how things work if you don't know.
Yeah, I think it is a really hard thing to do, and we've talked about reparations here before. I think there are a few different kind of ways to break it down. You can ask, what's the best that we can do for people right now? How can we make sure people are as well off as possible? And that's a question you can actually answer. When you start getting in, or it's not necessarily an easy question to answer, but it's something that we at least know where to start and what to look into. When you start getting into questions of what people deserve based on historical injustices, and that can either be harm that was done to them in the past, or maybe what they contributed, because this to put it into the labor theory of value, you can look at the labor of slaves, and that's all work that was put in that was not compensated for. Well, I mean, not compensated. It was compensated for in the sense that the owners fed and clothed the slaves or whatever. But I think we can all agree that that was a situation that was not ideal for the people who were enslaved. And that's something that it's good that we're not doing anymore, and we feel ashamed that we ever did it. But that's different from in terms of what to do today, you know, there are different problems that need to be solved. There's the problem of how do you make sure people aren't poor? How do you make sure people are as prosperous as possible, including anyone who's descended from slaves? And then there's the question of kind of like the how do we emotionally kind of reconcile with our past? And you know, you see, we were talking about or Bethany and I had watched Hotel Rwanda recently, and we were talking about truth and reconciliation and stuff like that, where you kind of admit that all this horrible stuff happened, and you can't really make up for it. You know, all of the people who suffered, you know, in slavery are you know, you can't undo that suffering, and now their descendants are possibly suffering or definitely suffering as a result of that circumstance. There's something you can do about that now. I'm not sure if the most efficient thing to do in terms of money is to kind of like tie it to that. I think there's the how do you maximize people's living conditions now, and then there's how do we you know, get past some of this moral stuff, and or not get past it, but how do we kind of process it? So generally, I'm not a fan of kind of just the idea that you can fix. There's some amount of money that you can pay out that would kind of like balance out what happened in history. You can't undo that. And in terms of figuring out the amount of money to give people, I'm generally more in favor of something like a basic income that goes to everyone, than trying to create some type of idea of, well, this is what's fair or what's just because of injustices in the past, and then you get into all kinds of wrinkles. And that's true with basic income too. Like some people say, well, we should set the basic income based on, or basic income should be paid out because you know, people aren't being paid for their work, or aren't being paid, aren't you know, being paid, work is being unpaid or something like that. It's not so much a moral thing. You can make it a moral thing, but when you make it a moral thing, it gets really complicated. Yeah. So let's see. We got some more comments on the live stream. I think we'll go to another quote from the article, though. Okay. Don't you think a rate of exploitation of 450% is good enough for the bosses? Don't you think they'd be happy getting a worker to put in about 11 minutes every hour to get his or her wages back while he/she works the other 49 minutes to keep the capitalist class in clover? Not on your Nelly, it's never enough. There is a compulsion on individual capitalists to squeeze more and more out of you. In part, the whip is supplied by competition with other firms. If you have to beat the opposition, the best way is to sell stuff cheaper. The best way to sell cheaper is to make it cheaper, that is, with less labor. They call it cutting costs, but that's what it is. Let's see what this race does for the development of the system as a whole. Yeah, Bethany, go ahead.
Well, I just noticed here that he frames the cost cutting in terms of how labor is paid less, which is a cost in our current system, especially. But he's not emphasizing the benefit to the consumer. So all of us, including the workers, are also buying things, and things that are made, you know, that are more affordable to people are generally a good thing. And that can reflect, you know, them using up less of people's time and less resources and things like that too. So I just wanted to point out there's kind of, he obviously has a very like strong opinion here. So there's kind of a lack of balance in pointing out the costs more than the benefits, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's true. And it's also important to note that in order to make these calculations even conceptually, like an exploitation rate of 450%, or you're putting in 11 minutes out of every hour to get your wages back, and the other 49 minutes goes to the boss. In order to do that, you have to really take these fuzzy situations and start defining clear lines. And it's not clear to me that you can really do that in a meaningful way. And then just the idea that you know, anything the boss earns is kind of not deserved or something like that. I don't know. There's definitely a lot of moralizing here, and it's only really a bad thing for like I was saying, it's only really a bad thing for labor to be getting a lot cheaper if people are depending on their jobs for their income.
And just a tiny second point, that competition might tend to actually make the profit margin for the employer quite small. So he's kind of like jumping around a little bit to me as well. Like if there's strong competition, then the profit margins might actually be quite low. Where he's also sort of suggesting that this owner or whatever is like making a whole bunch of money off of you, and both could be happening. But it just seems like
yeah, that's true.
The things that kind of make his point best. I get that feeling from.
Well, I think they're consistent in this way. He's saying the owners want to make as much money as possible, and they're also being squeezed at the same time in ways that reduce their profit. So he's speaking against the greediness of the owners, and he's also maybe speaking against competition here because competition forces wages lower.
Right, but but as I said, I find that interesting because we often think about how competition can be helpful for everyday people. Well,
yeah, that's a good point. Okay, let's go to Derek.
One thing I've always had trouble sort of understanding with this view is the distinction between who is a capitalist and who isn't, right? And how are the behaviors really uniquely different? Because I don't see how it is fundamentally different that, the owner of a company who wants someone's labor, like the labor is one person's labor is a good that's available for purchase from the economy. He, of course, is not going to want to pay more than he has to for that good. I don't see how that's different from a worker wanting not to pay as much for a good at the grocery store or something else. Everyone in this system faces similar pressures like that every day. And so the question is like, well, who's a capitalist, who's not? What is it about having a company that puts you into this other category where your behavior is different? I'm not sure that it is.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And that kind of speaks to what I was talking about before, where you have, people who are working on their passion, and then suddenly the business grows large enough, and suddenly some people in there are the bosses and the workers. Now there's a sudden dividing line, and someone's being exploited, and that kind of thing. It's really hard to. There's no clear distinction here. It's all on a continuum. So then when we draw these arbitrary lines, we're kind of pitting different people against each other. We're dividing them into classes and pitting those classes against each other. And that's kind of one of the things about Marx that I find interesting, is that he's viewing kind of our society as a constant class struggle. And he's maybe dividing people into classes when maybe in his time it was more clear who the bosses were and who the workers were, and that kind of thing. And like I was saying, it's gotten fuzzier these days with gig economy and stuff like that. But in general, there's no kind of intrinsic distinction there. Like, we're all participants in the economy, and we all do slightly different things. And to some extent, our laws have locked in certain roles, as whether you're a worker and a wage worker, or a salaried worker, or a contractor, or that kind of thing. But it's really hard. Like, if you're trying to do your taxes and you don't know whether you're self-employed, or are you a contractor, or is you're maybe only have one client, is that client really your boss, that kind of thing. It's useful for kind of his political position of wanting to create this group of people, or wanting to get a group of people to fight for the things they need. It's powerful rhetoric, but it doesn't really. It's not based on any kind of like pure fundamental truth or anything. Yeah. So on the live stream, TI Triple V says, or actually, let's go to Zach. He says the profit of a product is owned by the owner instead of the worker. Why shouldn't the worker share in the profits? So I think that's kind of like one of the fundamental questions of the labor theory of value. Like, why shouldn't the worker share in the profits? And I guess the answer to that question depends on what you think the role of the worker is. Is the worker someone who deserves to get paid for what they contribute, Or is the worker simply a person who's living their lives, and then someone comes along and says, hey, I'll give you $5 to spend a couple hours doing something different with your time, take it or leave it, right? So I think, Marx puts the workers in the position of not being able to make that choice, like they're dependent on the employers. And I guess I would question whether that arrangement is optimal in the first place. Do we want people's primary role in the economy to be workers and to force them to be dependent on employers for their survival? And I would say no. And having a basic income and thinking about basic income can kind of help get us away from that perspective. So you're asking, why shouldn't the workers be share in the profits? Another question is, why should the workers share in the profits? You're paying them enough to get them to do the thing. And I think that's a simpler way of thinking about the labor market, just getting people to spend their time in ways other than how they'd normally spend their time. And then some people might choose not to be workers, et cetera. But you can only really think about that without worrying about people suffering if you're also living in a world where people's primary source of income is not from jobs. Jobs are just this kind of extra thing. You pay people a little bit extra to get them to do something slightly different, that kind of thing. So let's go to Martin.
Yes, so I was just going to add the notion of the profit, where that goes. In some arrangements, in the form of dividends, it goes to the stockholders. And there's not a reason necessarily why a worker is not simultaneously a stockholder in the company in which the individual works. And that just sort of figures into my, I've expressed this before, that being stock in citizens who own a broad basket of stocks in the fourth industrial economy, which is, so they're not working. As we think of traditional labor, but they receive a dividend because they have ownership in the economy in the form of dividend-paying stocks.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are all great points. I think most people would point out that most workers do not own stocks, but there's no reason why it has to be that way. And of course, there are some who do. And then it's also, we can ask the question, why does anyone get paid for anything? And why do we have a sense that certain people deserve certain, payment or certain benefit or that kind of thing? And I think it all comes back to incentives. We pay workers to get them to do the work. We pay owners to provide an incentive for them to invest in the businesses. And if any of those incentives are out of whack, then we might want to change the rules. We might want to adjust, the parameters of the economy, our regulations, that kind of thing, and maybe our, taxes and fees and all of that, to get the incentives the way we want them, that kind of maximize the benefit to people. So maybe part of maximizing the benefit to people is that CEOs get paid 1,000 times as much as the workers at the bottom of their company or something like that. Maybe that's good for overall social outcomes, but we can't just look at it and say, oh, this person's contributing so much work, that person's contributing so much work. It's not fair that someone's being paid $10,000 a month or 10,000 times as much. $10,000 a month, I guess, is not that much for a CEO. But the question is, do we get the outcomes that we want in terms of how the market is structured? How are the businesses efficient, right? Like if we don't let businesses pay CEOs a lot, is that bad for consumers? Because then the potential CEOs would have no reason to go work at those businesses. Or is it good because all the CEOs want to be CEOs and they're all trying to get paid as much as possible? And then we put a cap on that and they're still going to go out there and be CEOs, but everyone's on a level playing field. So there's also that aspect of it too. But in terms of my intuition, I don't have a clear intuition that limiting the power of business owners or the pay of CEOs or the benefits of CEOs is somehow going to make people better off. If we're not thinking about living in a world where money is zero sum and you can't just pay people a basic income to kind of maximize their well-being in aggregate. So TIIIV says, also relevant, the private debt load that tends to grow on the aggregate compared to GDP. That's really troubling to employers. So I think it's troubling to everyone. Businesses don't want to have to borrow too much, and employers don't want to have to borrow too much either. And this is one of the things that basic income helps with, because right now we fund consumers by stimulating the financial sector using monetary policy. But we don't have to be doing that. If we have a basic income that's high enough, then that can allow us to tighten monetary policy and rein in the amount of private sector lending and the accumulation of private sector debt. So this is one of the main things that basic income gets us and that helps us with. Yeah, Martin, did you have another comment?
Yeah, so I just wanted to, again, in this notion, and if you want to look at sort of radical changes, the idea, we could look at inheritance and the notion that, if you're, what's the daughter of Steve Jobs, from sort of the American perspective, why do we have this notion that she should necessarily become a multi-billionaire just because of who her father used to be? And in some circles, that would probably be kind of a radical thing to say. And I think we've talked a little bit about this before. I mean, the top rate, I believe, on estates during the Eisenhower administration was, somewhere up there in the 75% level. And that changed considerably under Reagan. And I throw that out also because if we think in terms of, I consider myself knowledgeable about technology, and I could see where the economy is going. I don't say this as making a few years away from iRobot, the movie. I wouldn't say anything like that at all. But I do think that as you envision this sort of future, the week before it happens is not when you want to start duking it out, between sort of haves and have-nots. You probably should have engineered that into your system a long time sooner. And while I think some people would consider it very radical, I sort of consider the idea that when anybody passes away, but from the thought experiment point of view. So, what if all of it, Amazon stock passes into the treasury and through a system, but because of some sort of mechanism, I mean, we have Social Security, we have welfare programs, we have all other kinds of things that we consider social safety net that we're not, diametrically opposed to. I mean, we have them, right? So we need not necessarily be sort of in the dividend producing stock held by an individual. Upon that individual's passing, that doesn't pass to the individual's heirs. It passes to the treasury, and then it passes to citizens, say, as each citizen reaches the age of majority. Each citizen, you call it a UBI, but you might call it, uniform basic stock ownership, and in the economy. And then it just over time, it becomes sort of self-sustaining, and it can still have all the accoutrements of actually the system, even as we experience it today, because we know there are maybe not a lot of people, but there are people who, from the day they're born, would not necessarily have to work what we would call a traditional job one day in their life, because they'd simply live off the interest income of their inherited trust. And I don't say that to, cast, dispersion against people in that position. It's a nice position to be in, but my simple point is that we can think of almost a UBI type construct that we do right now today. And the people who are receiving that UBI like regular payment that they expect to have in perpetuity for the rest of their lives, should they manage it even just the least bit reasonably responsibly. We should have no compunction against doing the same for everyone that we already completely accept as being appropriate for some.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of elements to that. I think in terms of just taking away all of everybody's inheritance and giving it to the Treasury, we can ask the same question that I was asking before. How does it affect the incentives in the economy? So I think, it is true to some extent that people work in order to provide for their family, in order to pass something on. And then it's also true that if you put something like this in place, you can ask the question, would you not get the same contribution for people? But you can also ask the question, if everybody knows that all of their wealth is going to go away when they die, what are they going to do with it? So, if they have no incentive to say, hey, I want to accumulate all this wealth and pass it on to society, well, maybe instead I want to blow it all right away on, consumption that uses up a lot of resources, or I want to find a way to give it to people before I die, and that kind of thing. So then you have to kind of like factor in how you're going to handle all of that stuff. To what extent can certain aspects of this be prevented, and then to what extent are you okay with some of it? It can get pretty complicated. So obviously it's true that we do have inheritance taxes to some extent right now, and there might be some kind of like optimal level of that where you're kind of evening people out a little bit, or evening families out, and preventing this kind of like ultra accumulation of inheritance and that kind of thing. But it's not clear to me that this would necessarily be optimal. Did you have a response, Martin?
Yeah. So I was just going to add, I was going to sort of take to that. Well, part of it is we're just very used to this idea of inheritance, and again, I'm not. I'm not so much for or against inheritance. I'm a little bit, I sort of think, we're all created equal, and that shouldn't change radically 1 second after you're born. And quite frankly, I look at someone like my son. My son just happens to be in a kind of work that is, some would call it lucrative, right? I mean, he does and expects to out earn most of us, maybe all of us on this chat session, and some of that is choice, some of it is but some of it is that I was able to provide him an education, and some other things that people who come from reasonably reasonable economic circumstances are able to do. And so I'm sure it'd be nice if I were to leave him a large inheritance or something, but he's doing okay, right? I mean, and he's doing okay compared to a lot of people. So anyway, I think you're sort of striking the third rail if you start talking about inheritance kinds of things, or sort of changing that, the way we think about it. But I would also add that I don't know, I'm not a tax guy, tax expert, but there are limits on how much money you can gift to a child every year, and what some of the very wealthiest people do in being able to pass on. I'm not saying that it's illegal, but you
So you're breaking up a little bit again, Martin. You might want to turn off your video. That might give you more bandwidth.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that some people who pass on these very large inheritances, there is sort of a mechanism to prevent that. But I think that what happened in practical matters, people of more modest means, sufficient means to pass on a considerable amount of wealth, but not huge amounts of wealth, are operate under a tax code that actually sort of makes that a little bit harder than necessarily easier, right? So there's a certain amount of, the system isn't sort of radically transparent, radically fair. If you just happen to be radically wealthy, then you can pass on radical amounts of money. And if you're modest wealth, you can pass on modest wealth. And the system isn't necessarily exactly that. And the last thing I'd say is that I don't know which country or countries it is, but there are a couple of countries. I want to say that I believe these are African countries that deal with systemic corruption and very, very high levels of corruption. And where you think of filing a tax,
I think you're thinking of America. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, yeah. When you think of filing a tax return about your, so you're paying taxes on your income, in these countries, you file a statement of your wealth, your net wealth, and you do that because what they're monitoring for is somebody who suddenly goes from having very little to having an awful lot. And it's specifically designed to prevent people from passing wealth along, where the assumption is that that wealth was obtained through illicit means and through corruption. And so it acts as an anti-corruption tool, but it is an example of so I'm saying that there are at least some examples of a world the way I could envision it. I'm not saying it's going to happen in America, but I could envision a system where people start at a sort of a relatively level playing field, whatever your term is, and still do okay, and consistent with what we today as Americans think is a system that we're all willing to accept, i.e. the system we have today.
Yeah, I think those are interesting points, and I even think we could probably do a whole discussion on inheritance. I guess we did one on retirement, but we didn't do one on inheritance. That might be an interesting topic. We could get into some of like the Thomas Piketty stuff even. I think one point that I wanted to bring up about your idea is that we can also, so in addition to asking the question of how it might affect the incentives of the people who are going to pass on their inheritance, we can also ask how it would affect the amount of basic income we can afford to give people, right? So just because we're taking a bunch of money away from, Steve Jobs' daughter or Bill Gates's kids or something like that, doesn't necessarily mean that the economy has the capacity to sustain higher levels of consumer spending across, a broad consumer base. So part of me wonders if it wouldn't make sense to separate the idea of basic income, giving money to everyone, from this idea of taking away people's inheritance or taking away some amount of people's inheritance, because there's no reason necessarily why the two numbers should have to line up. Why it's 1-to-1, the amount you take away from people's inheritance is also the amount you happen to be able to pay out to people in the basic income. So that's something worth exploring, I think. So we are, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, try not to think of it as taking away, because it never got to the person to take it away from the person in, the way that I conceptualize
Well,
it.
you're taking it away from the person who died, I suppose. Yeah.
And like they say, you can't take it with you. So.
Well, yeah, they're not taking it with them. Although there are some cultures that bury people with, money and stuff. So I don't know. But I guess that's kind of the equivalent. You just bury them with the money, and then you can. That would have the same result, I suppose. It doesn't go to the kids.
Right.
So let's see. I do want to get to one more quote from the article. I think I want to do this one. Oh, yeah. I'll do a couple more, and then we'll get to people's final thoughts. Okay. The apologists of the capitalist economy say that markets give us consumer sovereignty. The market system is in effect a giant economic democracy where we vote with our money for what we want. not just once every 5 years, but every time you go down the road for a bottle of milk. Consumers weigh up what goods they want most. For their part, producers have to give the people what they want in the quantities they want, otherwise they go out of business. So I like this quote because we definitely take a consumer perspective here, or a lot of times when we're talking about this stuff. And basic income is a very consumer-oriented policy, right? People can't vote with their dollars if they don't have any dollars. So I think it's very much true that basic income can kind of help make this ideal of the market being a giant economic democracy more close to reality, and I think that's probably a good thing. And then the next quote that I want to do is this one. This is actually the next paragraph. So neoclassical economics starts with people's wants, but where do they come from? Are they just exogenously given, as they say in the textbooks? Most of our wants are provided by the possibilities for humans given by the development of the productive system. It is quite likely that medieval peasants were bored on long winter nights. It is unlikely that they sat around wishing someone would hurry up and invent television. And the idea that these days giant oligopoly, I think that's how you say it, firms make their money by giving people what they want is quaint, but naive. On the contrary, they spend vast sums making sure that we will want what they give us by manipulating people's wants. So this is kind of a chicken and egg question. Which comes first, the demand or the supply? And we've talked about this before in this group. But this is emphasizing the kind of advertising and manipulation of consumers aspect, which of course is a real thing. But does that mean that that's the first thing we should think about? That demand is really just this thing that we're manipulated into, that we're going to want to buy what the marketers tell us that we want to buy. And to some extent it's true. To some extent, everybody needs to eat. Everybody needs to have kind of healthcare and a roof over their heads and stuff like that. Maybe Marxists would argue that these things are so simple to provide that you can do it independently of the market or something like that. And then the stuff that really is left to the market is all these things that we don't actually need or something like that. So these are some interesting thoughts for us to kind of finish on. You can think about, if you're thinking about the output value as opposed to the input value, labor is an input theory of value. If we're thinking about an output theory of value, then we kind of have to take into account people's wants being manipulated in this way. So let's go around and get people's final thoughts. We'll start with Derek, and then Richard, and then Bethany.
I like to sort of imagine a dysfunctional conversation happening between these two authors, where one of them is trying to say that there's this, enormous, horrible problem with the system, and the other person is trying to say just what a wonderful and great system it is. And I see this happen a lot. I see that people who have the Marxist or the socialist critique of the current system are, I would say, I think they're correct that there's something horribly broken or missing or wrong with the current system. But the other people are also right that there's a lot of things about it that work really well, and a kind of a consumer-oriented market is actually kind of a really cool thing. But there's a failure to imagine, I think, what the other person would be thinking. Why would the other person think that? Notice all of these great things that are working, and also why would the other person think that maybe it's a horrible system and it's not working? And I always just sort of wish I could get them to, come to some sort of mutual understanding on that question.
Yeah, let's go Richard, Bethany, and then Elizabeth.
Well, building on what Derek said about how they have this functional conversation, well, there's a story about how Alexander the Great came across the so-called mad Socrates, like I think his name's like Diocles or something like that, and he asked the so-called mad Socrates about how he's like being mistreated and things, and so whatever he wants, he would want, he would take everything away from the everyone else in Athens. And so, as Socrates said, he was like, "Get out of my sun, because you're blocking it and talking to me." And so, Alexander the Great said, "I can no more take the sun away from you than I couldn't give the sun to you than I could take it away from anyone else." And so, the Marxist author, they would want take everything away from the capitalists, whilst the what is it? The
Austrian.
neoclassicist author, he would want to like take as much away possible from the workers and things. So it's sort of like that quote.
Okay, that's an interesting analogy. Let's go Bethany, and then Elizabeth, and then Martin.
Yeah, I think this was interesting. I think I got some clarity on kind of the resonance of the labor theory. I think my guess is with you that it comes from the fact that when we're trying to incentivize, individual people, we do emphasize the value that they're creating with their efforts and with their hard work. And so then it's kind of a weird flip to think about people's payment not really necessarily being all that closely tied to that. And I feel like we have those two mindsets kind of contradict. And I think that seems like a lot of where the author of the second article was coming from. That, and just people get their incomes currently from their jobs, and so like without much income they're not well off, and so if you want people to be well off, like it makes sense that you start to focus on how they might get more income, and then we often tend to make kind of moral arguments for why people should get what we want them to get. So I think that's kind of where I'm thinking the some of the punch of this theory comes from. But yeah, great discussion. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, good stuff. Let's go Elizabeth, and then Martin.
Yeah, I appreciated the conversation. I don't think that I have any particular closing thoughts.
Okay, Martin, go ahead.
So I'm going to suggest that the virus and the lockdowns and all that we could see a considerable change in the economy, and an awful lot. Well, so you could see businesses like restaurants and anything that could largely be automated away. You could automate away a lot of office building maintenance and cleaning and all kinds of things that we may be learning how to do without and may have to do without. And so the upshot of that could be that you have far fewer people producing as much as the economy has always produced. And in other words, it's so hard to change people's habits, so to speak, that we still were making quite a bit of use of downtown office buildings for office work, and people in going to sports events, and all these kinds of things. And these were all jobs, and they were all sort of functioning parts of the economy. But you could envision a lot of them going away, and creating at least a bubble of sort of systemic unemployment, because you can't even get people close enough to do certain kinds of work, even if you wanted to. There would be a market for it, but you can't do it because we're in this sort of pandemic sort of state. And that won't be forever. But my point is that people are thinking about this now where they didn't think about it in the past. Because they can, and because some are going to say, okay, it's this pandemic and we're past this one, but what about the next one? And how long is it going to take us to make the vaccine for that one? So you could see this real systemic change, and I would not be surprised that between that and just simply some of this fourth industrial kind of revolution, sort of evolution in the economy, you may actually see more interest in Marxist thought, not less. I would argue that it will be misplaced, but I would not be surprised to see it.
Okay, that's an interesting point. And I think another thing we're learning from the pandemic is just how much of our labor is already not essential. And I think there's going to be a lot of jobs that just don't come back because we didn't necessarily need them. So that kind of maybe might cause people to question some of their sense of the value of labor and that kind of stuff too. So this was a great discussion. I think, you know, I just want to speak again to kind of the advertising and manipulating consumers thing, because deep down in my heart, in my core, I feel like I want the economy to operate for the benefit of people. And that means taking an output value theory kind of approach, viewing the economy through an output value lens. So maybe there's this problem where people are being unnecessarily manipulated to their detriment. But I still, you know, I think that's a problem we would want to deal with, but we still ultimately want things to be better for people. And I think that's something everybody kind of agrees on, even if you're a labor value theory of value type person as well. So that's kind of my final thought that I want to leave it on. Next week's topic is state level basic income. So we often talk about basic income being implemented at the level of a whole country that has, you know, its own fiscal authority and monetary authority, central bank, et cetera. But what about trying to implement the basic income at a lower level? We've talked in the past about a city that implements a basic income, but what about at the level of a state in the United States or a province? They face different constraints on their spending than a city would face, but also different constraints than the national government would face. And this also applies to countries in Europe as well, where they have this giant currency zone, but each individual country has its own kind of government institutions. So we're going to get into that. That'll be next week's discussion. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks, Alex.